Hey everyone, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a highly provocative, really sweeping geopolitical analysis by Richard Medhurst. The source material paints this wild picture of a world caught right in the middle of a massive, albeit totally quiet, hostile takeover of global oil and gas supplies. It's this incredibly complex web of geopolitics, economics, and military strategy. So let's map it all out.
First things first, we got to define the core concept here. What exactly is a pirate state? Well, Medhurst argues the U.S. is actively transitioning away from being a traditional empire into exactly this. The big shift here is purely tactical. According to the analysis, instead of occupying land and building endless military bases, this new model enforces global economic dominance entirely on the ocean, through maritime disruption, strategic sabotage, and outright resource extortion on the high seas.
To make sense of this sprawling 90-day global energy blitz, we're breaking the analysis down into 5 parts. 1. The petrogas-dollar theory. 2. Capturing the European market. 3. Squeezing competitors and rivals. 4. The maritime protection racket. And 5. The petrodollar paradigm shift. Let's get into it.
All right, Section 1. The petrogas-dollar theory. There's a really massive historical contrast at the foundation of this theory. Picture the U.S. back in the 1970s. It was highly vulnerable to oil shocks. If the Strait of Hormuz closed, it was an absolute catastrophe, right? The dollar would crash, people would panic buy gold. Fast forward to the near future, and today, the U.S. is an absolute energy behemoth. It's the world's top producer of oil, gas, and liquefied natural gas, or LNG, totally self-sufficient. But here's the catch. Even if you're the #1 producer, you still need people to buy it. And to get a true monopoly, the theory argues, you literally have to eliminate global competition to force a captive market to buy your own, far more expensive energy.
Moving right along to Section 2, capturing the European market.
Medhurst's analysis points directly at the Ukraine conflict for this. By allegedly blowing up the Nord Stream pipelines, the U.S. achieved a massive strategic victory, totally eliminating the cheap Russian gas that Europe had relied on for decades. Because of that, Europe had to pivot, and fast. Almost overnight, the U.S. went from supplying just 9% of Europe's energy to becoming its absolute #1 source of coal, oil, and LNG. And crucially, they're selling it at a massive premium. Europe essentially transformed into an energy client, propping up the U.S. dollar.
But the strategy doesn't stop in Europe. Medhurst traces this incredibly tight, highly suspicious sequence of events in the Middle East. Check this timeline out. It kicks off in October with a Gaza ceasefire, followed immediately in November by a UN Board of Peace summit, which the source alleges was actually just a corporate front. Then, boom, it culminates in December with a staggering $35 billion gas deal for Chevron. The explainer frames this whole timeline as a calculated move by the US and Israel to sideline competitors and grab a huge energy reserve off the coast of Europe, all hidden under the cover of conflict.
Next up is Section 3, squeezing competitors and rivals.
So, controlling Europe? That was really just stage 1. The ultimate target here is actually China. The problem is China is way too big to take head-on, so the strategy shifts. Control the giant by cutting off its fuel. In a highly coordinated 90-day window, the U.S. allegedly targeted China's 3 main oil lifelines. That meant sending a fleet to seize Venezuelan heavy crude, hunting Russian tankers, and backing strikes on their export hubs, and heavily disrupting Iranian transit. The entire goal is to force Beijing into a corner where they have absolutely no choice but to rely on American energy. To really wrap your head around the sheer scale of this, look at this number, 40%. The source claims that 40% of Russia's seaborne oil export capacity was disabled by U.S.-backed strikes on refineries and export hubs. Think about that. That is the most severe oil disruption in modern Russian history, all allegedly designed to enforce a massive global oil blockade against Washington's rivals.
Now, you might be thinking, is this all just wild speculation? Well, this sweeping geopolitical theory is actually grounded in explicit political rhetoric. Take this quote from Donald Trump. The source uses this to argue that the U.S. isn't just getting lucky with global chaos, but is actively and openly seizing foreign resources, like Venezuelan oil, to leverage its own dominance. The assertion here is that they are literally saying the quiet part out loud.
And it's not just oil either. The scope extends right into natural gas through a series of, frankly, incredibly timed disruptions. Strikes in Qatar suddenly took out 20% of the global LNG supply. A cyclone in Australia just coincidentally took half of the planet's second-largest LNG supplier offline at the exact right moment. And Cuba's entire power grid went dark after Venezuelan oil was allegedly seized. The analysis frames us not as a string of bad luck, but as a deliberate strategy to send spot market prices soaring. And who's left as the only reliable, though incredibly expensive supplier? The U.S.
Which brings us to Section 4. The maritime protection racket.
All this physical destruction builds into what Medhurst describes as a literal maritime extortion network. The U.S. allegedly profits at every single stage of the transit process. Step 1. Destroy the cheap piped gas from your competitors. Step 2. Sell your own gas using mobile U.S. LNG ships that can just pivot mid-ocean to whoever is willing to pay the absolute highest wartime price. Step 3. Use initiatives like the Maritime Action Plan to force the countries buying this energy to transport it on U.S.-made ships, so you're pumping massive investments into American shipyards. Basically, you're paying Uncle Sam at every single turn.
Adding a whole other layer to this is a proposed U.S. Navy protection service. The video uses this to solidify the argument that we are looking at a global protection racket on the high seas. If you want your energy to travel safely through waters that are now intentionally chaotic, you literally have to pay the U.S. military to be your bodyguard.
So what's the real-world impact of all this? By making energy unaffordable everywhere else, this strategy triggers the actual deindustrialization of U.S. allies in Europe and Asia. Huge industrial giants, think Mercedes, Toyota, Siemens, find it way too expensive to operate at home anymore, forcing a massive flight of capital. They have to relocate their factories to the United States just to get the energy they need to keep the assembly lines running. And here's why you should care. This completely rewrites the global supply chain, cannibalizes allied economies, and directly impacts where jobs are created globally.
Finally, let's hit Section 5, the petrodollar paradigm shift.
We're looking at a massive historical pivot here. The 1970s petrodollar was completely reliant on Gulf oil and required these super vulnerable, incredibly expensive land bases across the Middle East to maintain. But what the source says we're witnessing now is the birth of the petrogas-dollar. This new system is pegged to domestic U.S. energy production and allegedly seized foreign oil. And the kicker? It's enforced entirely from the ocean via naval blockades. No bases needed. That makes it far stronger and way less dependent on Middle Eastern politics.
And here's where it acts as a brutal counter-move against BRICS nations who are desperately trying to move away from the US dollar. Physical piracy creates this inescapable trap that neutralizes all those alternative payment systems. Look, it honestly doesn't matter if you price your oil in yuan or rubles, if the cargo gets sunk before it ever reaches the port. The resulting shortages force these nations right back to the emergency spot market to buy the missing energy from the United States, and they have to pay for it in US dollars. It's a catch-22 that ironically strengthens the exact currency they're trying to escape.
But of course, a strategy like this doesn't just go unchallenged. Nations like Iran are actively resisting, and according to the analysis, they're punching way above their weight. By leveraging drone and missile tactics, they are allegedly neutralizing billion-dollar U.S. radar arrays, degrading highly advanced aircraft like F-35s and Reapers, and even striking the USS Gerald R. Ford Navy flagship. From a game theory perspective, they are trying to make this piracy strategy so painfully expensive for the U.S. that Washington is forced to abandon it, shattering the whole myth of American military invincibility along the way.
So we're left with one really big, critical question to ponder. Can the U.S. actually pull this off? Can they sustain a global energy monopoly and prop up their currency through maritime disruption? Or will this heavy-handed pirate state strategy just push global rivals to unite, ultimately accelerating the fall of the very dollar it was designed to protect? It's definitely a fascinating framework for looking at the shifting tectonic plates of global energy. Thanks for diving into this explainer with me.